What up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Ask Paul, sponsored by Electrical Code Academy Incorporated, your one-stop shop for all your National Electrical Code learning toolkits. You can learn the NEC, you can learn residential, commercial, grounding and bonding, electricity 101. If you want to become more knowledgeable in the National Electrical Code, and you're an electrical inspector, or maybe an engineer, or maybe you're just a supervisor, or somebody that just really wants to understand what the NEC is all about to make your job much easier, more compliant, less issues with inspectors, do me a favor, go over our website, electricalcodeacademy.net. You'll see the fast track reference there. It's the leading program for understanding the National Electrical Code. You get access to me on Wednesday nights. You get to ask questions. You get a competency reviews. It's an extensive program that teaches you the National Electrical Code. And what it does is it builds on these tools to help you become very self-sufficient in being able to utilize the NEC as you move further in your career. That's what it's designed to do. Okay, there's no quick fix here. You need to learn the code, and our program will teach you the code. And it just makes your job so much easier. Now, if you're first time you've ever listened to this podcast, look, we have tons of podcasts out there, literally hundreds of them, and videos. All you've got to do is go over to electricianlive.com. That's electricianlive.com, and you'll see our portal there, and you'll have access to multiple channels. That's the Electrified channel. You'll get the Ask Paul channel, which is sponsoring this podcast today. And of course, you'll get the Master the NEC. You click on it and you get a bunch of information on whatever channel you're interested in. Bookmark that site because more podcasts are coming from other providers as we expand that network. So again, it wants to be your one-stop shop for all electrical training and electrical information, and basically just a repository of electrical information. Now, if you want to submit your question to be answered on a podcast like today, or an email response answering your question, guess what? We have put together that at paulabernathy.com. paulabernathy.com. You can go there, put your name in, put your email in, put your question in, click the button. It comes to me, and I will either answer your question via email, or if selected, it will be used on an upcoming podcast like today's podcast. All right. So again, we appreciate everybody that listens to our podcasts. Again, it's available on Spotify, Spreaker, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. There's so many other different, wherever you go to listen to your podcasts, just search for Master the NEC or search for Ask Paul, and you will find it. Trust me. We're all over the place. All right. So today's question was submitted to me, and so I'm going to go through it and try to answer the question I can as quickly as I can and as detailed as I can to try to answer that question. Dear Paul, can you please explain the differences in 312.2 versus 314.15 when it comes to damp and wet locations? I am confused at the difference of the two. Thanks in advance. Okay, so based on the information that's submitted, the individual is dealing with a damp or wet location, and they're confused with the rules in 312.2, which is dealing with damp and wet locations for cabinets, cutout boxes, and meter socket enclosures, as it pertains to 314.15 damp and wet locations, which deals with outlet boxes, junction boxes, pull boxes, device boxes, conduit bodies, the fittings like a weather head that go on the top of a riser, for example, that's a fitting, or handhold enclosures. So there's a difference. So 314 is very specific to those items: outlet box, pull box, junction box, device box, conduit bodies like LBs, LLs, LRs, things like that, conduits. Fittings, like example of fitting that would go on the top of a raceway that's maybe for an overhead where you have a weather head on the top, preventing moisture from entering in there. You'll see what we're talking about in a minute. And of course, handhold enclosures as well. That's what 314 deals with. When you think of 312, think of cabinets, cutout boxes, and meter sockets. So think of cabinets as the enclosure that a panel board would go into. So if you have a NEMA 3R cabinet, you're going to have a panel inside of that, and that will go on the outside of the building, right? Typically, that's where you'd sit. So remember that we're talking about in 312, cutout boxes could be like an exterior disconnect. we'll say that because we're talking about wet and damp locations, so it kind of keeps us in the context of what we're talking about. But also meter socket enclosures, vastly different in 312 than what you get in 314, although similar when it comes to the damp and wet location rules here, but we're going to break each one of them down so you know the differences. Now, the first thing that I always tell people to do is to read the scope of every article so that you know what you're dealing with, right? So I'm going to read 312.1 first. So that's dealing with cabinets, cutout boxes, and meter socket enclosures, and I promise you, I will answer your question. So here's what the scope says. It says this article, and again, 312, covers the installation and construction specifications of cabinets, cutout boxes, and meter socket enclosures. It does not apply to equipment operating at over 1,000 volts, except as specifically referenced elsewhere in the code. So again, somewhere else in the code, there will be an application for over 1,000 volts dealing with cabinets, cutout boxes, or potentially meter socket enclosures. But right now, when it comes to 312, we're talking about the applications that are operating at what? Not over 1,000 volts. So that's 312. So that's the scope. So real quick, we want to jump and read the scope of 314 real quick so we can kind of see the difference in the two. So what's the scope of 314.1? It says this article covers the installation and use of all boxes and conduit bodies used as outlet, device, junction, or pull boxes, depending on their use, and handhold enclosures, cast metal, sheet metal, non-metallic, and other boxes such as FS or FD, and larger boxes are not classified, and larger boxes are not classified as conduit bodies. This article also includes, now listen to this, this article also includes installation requirements for fittings used to join raceways, okay, so fittings to join raceways together, like a coupling, for example, and to connect raceways and cables to boxes and conduit bodies, so connectors as well. I'll remind you that this also would encompass something like, again, the cap that would go on the weatherhead on the top of a riser. So if you had a raceway going up and you had the cap on the top, because you're going to have conductors that come into it through these openings, and we don't want water to be getting all into those. So again, kind of giving you a perspective of when we make a reference to fittings, that's an example of a fitting in case you get lost and think, all I'm talking about is fittings between raceways. No, we're also talking about the fitting that would, again, go in the head for a weatherhead. That would be a fitting, if you will. All right, so now we're going to backtrack back, and we're going to look at 312.2. And this is dealing with damp and wet locations. Now we're going to look at what it says. And anytime we're going to identify something that it does not say that might be significant as well to keep in mind. But we're going to focus on what it says. But we will make reference if there's something that sticks out that I should make you aware of. All right, 312.2 says damp and wet locations. Now remember the context here. We're installing a cabinet, a cutout box, or a meter socket enclosure in a damp or wet location. These are the rules. It says in a damp or wet location, the surface type enclosures within the scope of this article shall be placed or equipped so as to prevent moisture or water from entering or accumulating within the cabinet or cutout box. Okay, so it's basically saying, look, I need you to orient this, or the placement of this cabinet or cutout box needs to be done in a way, and if it has openings on it, it has to be equipped so as to prevent moisture or water from entering and accumulating within the cabinet or cutout box. Now, you'll notice that it doesn't say anything about meter socket enclosure at this point, right? It just made a reference to cabinet or cutout box, whether it's intended or an oversight, that's all it says. And it says, and shall be mounted so that there is at least 1/4 inch airspace between the enclosure and the wall or other supporting surface. All right, we're going to stop right there for a second. So we know there's an exception down here for a non-metallic, so we're going to just assume metallic at this point. You've seen cabinets, you've seen cutout boxes that have the little nipples in the back where the mounting holes are, and it's designed to stand it off 1/4 inch. Now, if you're still using these metal boxes, let's say, and it doesn't have the nipples, then you would have to install it in a way with a spacer or something that's going to give you that 1/4 inch. This is to keep water from accumulating and sitting behind there and causing it to corrode and things like that over time. We need that space to allow the water to drain past it. Okay. So that's what you would do with that. Now we have an exception down here, and that's the reason I wanted to stop right here. If we jump to the exception real quick under 312.2, you'll see that this is not necessary if the enclosure is a non-metallic enclosure. And it's no airspace is needed where it's mounted on concrete, masonry, tile, or similar surface, which tends to be porous and will retain water. Okay. So if it is non-metallic, you don't need that space at all. But here, you need that space if it's a metal box. Okay. So we're clear on that. Now let's continue on a little more. It says enclosures installed in wet locations shall be weatherproof. Okay, so remember what this is saying. This is saying this is saying cabinet, cutout boxes, and meter socket enclosures. That is encompassing all three. Whereas earlier when we talked about to prevent water from entering and accumulating within the cabinet or cutout box, it shall be mounted to that 1/4 inch space. When that was talking about that, it was talking about cabinets and cutout boxes. That's what it was talking about. Here it says enclosures in general, which would apply to cabinets, cutout boxes, and meter sockets, all of which are in an enclosure. And it tells us that enclosures installed in wet locations shall be weatherproof. So if you're looking and you're trying to determine weatherproofness of an enclosure, you're going to look at the listing of that enclosure. But one other place to go that I will tell you that will give you a good list of all the different types of enclosures and their ratings is table 110.28. And that is a table for enclosure selection, and it's based on a NEMA rating. And NEMA has an enclosure rating, whether it's a NEMA 1, NEMA 2, NEMA 3, NEMA 3R, 3S for stainless steel, 3Xs. It goes up the list all the way up to, I believe, 13. Now, once you select your enclosure, again, you want to make sure that it is rated, for example, for weatherproof. Now, if you were to look at this list, just for craps and giggles, and if you're looking at the outdoor application and you're looking here, you'll see all of this list down here. You have to kind of go to the notes that are underneath the table, and it gets kind of interesting because if you look at the notes, you'll look into it and say, okay, informational note number 1, it says rain tight is typical used in conjunction with enclosures 3, 3S, 3SX, 3X, 4, 4X, whatever, and 6B. It says term rain proof is typically used in conjunction with enclosure types 3R and 3RX. The term watertight is typically used in conjunction with enclosures 4, 4X, 6, and 6P. All right, just bear with me here. It says the term drip tight is typically used in conjunction with enclosure type 2, 5, 12, 2K, and 13. The term dust tight is typically used in conjunction with enclosures 3, 3S, 3SX, 3X, 4, 4X, 5, 6, and 6P, 12, 12K, and 13. You with me? Has a long list on there, but you notice that it doesn't make any reference in that to dealing with weatherproof, right? You with me so far? So that is usually where people start to get really confused with this. And so that's why I'm bringing it up. So now if we go back to chapter 1 and you have definitions, article 100, remember definitions are where the definition is used in more than one article. It's going to be here in 100. Under the 2020 code, if it's only germane to that specific article, it will be under .2. And I remind you that in the 2023 code, that all changes and all the definitions are going to be in article 100, by the way. So kind of get used to that. But if you go back to chapter 1 and you look under weatherproof, because remember, let me go back, and I believe it says that it has to be weatherproof for these enclosures in a wet location. So with that said, we're going to go back and look at the definition of weatherproof, because when we saw 110.28, we saw all those notes and we didn't see any reference to weatherproof. So that means that the term weatherproof can be pretty broad. So let's go to the definition. Article 100, weatherproof says, constructed or protected so that exposure to the weather will not interfere with the successful operation. And then underneath it, you're saying, okay, well, what listings does that mean? Well, if you look at the informational note below, it gives you the guidance, and that's what informational notes are there for. It says, look, rainproof, rain tight, or watertight equipment can fulfill the requirement for weatherproof. Okay, where varying weather conditions other than wetness, such as snow, ice, dust, or temperature extremes, are not a factor. Okay, so if it's got to be weatherproof, and that's all we're going for, and we're not dealing with the condition of snow, ice, dust, or that type of accumulation or extreme weather, then I can choose an enclosure that is rainproof, rain tight, or watertight and be okay. You with me? Now, if it is more extreme than that, then I would go to 110.28 and look for something that is more towards the extreme, like, for example, rain, snow, sleet, and then you would follow across and you'll see which are rated for that. And you're just going to step your game up beyond that. But in general, it gets you to the starting point of where you need to be. And in most cases for us, NEMA 3Rs outside, things like that, are going to be perfectly okay to meet the waterproof nature. So anyway, that's kind of a little lesson through looking at 110.28, then looking at the definition of weatherproof, and then seeing how you have all these terminologies that can actually meet the weatherproof statement. Okay? All right, so we walked through all that. And we're still not done. It says for enclosures in wet locations, it says race. Now I'm at the last part of 312.2 now, folks. It says for enclosures in wet locations, raceways and cables entering above the level of uninsulated live parts shall use fittings listed for wet locations. All right, I'm going to paint you this mental picture. You ready? I have outside, I have a weatherhead at the top. And of course, that weatherhead at the top, we want to make sure that you're using one of these weatherheads at the top with the inserts in it that's going to limit the moisture. It's just sized for the conductors to go in. Comes down through the raceway, goes through the meter, and it goes into the top of an exterior NEMA 3R panel. And so, since they're entering through the top, then I have to make sure that coming through the top, that enclosure, again, entering, that's going to be above live parts. So that means the fitting that's being used has to be listed for wet location. Now, it's probably going to be a hub, and that's going to be fine because it's going to have a grommet on it around the hub base and whatnot. Or it might even be a Myers hub that is listed for it with the grommet's sake. So it might maintain that rating of that penetration. Okay? But what's important here is that any entry that comes into the top or the sides from a raceway or cable, if it's above those uninsulated live parts, and I'm going to remind you that this doesn't apply just to termination of conductors. This also applies to the exposed actual bus. Okay, so even whether there's a breaker in it or not, it's a bus. It is uninsulated live parts. So you're going to draw an imaginary line across this cabinet at the point where the live bus ends. And everything below that is going to be a situation where, example, let me give you another example. If I came in from the top and I used SEU, and I come in from the top and I go down and through the meter, I come out of the meter and I go into the top of the meter can enclosure, the meter socket enclosure, then I have to use a fitting that is rated for a wet location because it is above live parts. Now I come out of the bottom of that meter and I go into the top of the panel board. Now, the portion that's on the bottom of the meter, that could be a standard SE clamp, but not the point where it goes into the top of the panel. That would have to be because that's above live metal parts, right? For that enclosure. So I have to maintain it there. Now, what if I want to come in to the bottom of the actual panel cabinet? Then I could come into the bottom with, EMT standard fittings. They would not have to be rated for a wet location. If I had SE cables coming into the bottom, I could use standard SE clamps. I don't need anything special unless I'm coming into these cabinets above live part. And you treat each cabinet, you treat each enclosure individually. You treat the meter socket enclosure individually. You treat the cabinet individually. And again, if I'm going to be entering that cabinet, that enclosure, Keep it simple. Let's keep it to enclosure because that's what it says. If I'm entering that enclosure, which does encompass cabinets, cutout boxes, and meter sockets, if I'm entering that above the horizontal line of uninsulated live parts, anything above that, whether I'm coming in on the side or the top, then I must use what? A fitting that is listed for a wet location. And it must also maintain the rating of that cabinet. So it's going to have, if it's rated for a wet location, it's going to probably have grommets on it because, again, we have to make sure that we prevent moisture and water from accumulating into the cabinet, right? So we're going to make sure that by using a proper fitting. And it reminds us here, it says for enclosures in wet locations, and all three of these are enclosures, by the way, raceways and cables entering above the level of uninsulated live parts shall use fittings that are listed for a wet location. All right? Clear. We're all good. Okay, so now that is 312, cabinets, cutout boxes, and meter sockets. So now how does that apply to when we look at 314.15? Well, let's look at it. So now 314.15, we know we're talking about now outlet, device, pull, junction boxes, conduit bodies. We're talking about fittings, and I gave you an example of a fitting that would be not just connecting between raceways or two boxes, but also, for example, the fitting that's on the top of a weatherhead. If you had a riser raceway going up and you were coming in with your service drops through the end of the weatherhead, that's a fitting on the end, by the way. So this rule is going to apply to that. So here's what the code says. A damp or wet location. It says in damp or wet locations, boxes, conduit bodies, outlet box hoods, and fittings shall be placed or equipped so as to prevent moisture from entering or accumulating in the box, conduit body, or fitting. So the best example I can give is basically you want to position it in a way that orients it and install it so that it prevents moisture from entering or accumulating. Now, one of the things that I've seen people use as an example is when you go up to the side of the building and you have a mast, and on the end of the mast you have the weatherhead cap, and they do it in a way. If it's straight up, it's not a problem. But if you've seen it go up and run along the perimeter of the roof line, and they get to the top and they turn the weatherhead up, and those openings allow rain to just simply get right in there. That would be an example where that fitting was not placed in a way to prevent moisture or water from entering into it. Okay. You want to make sure you turn it down. Of course, you've got your drip loops that you got to have and all those type of things. But that is when you talk about the fitting, how it's to be oriented. Okay. So that's just kind of giving you an example and giving you the fitting as an example. We would do the same thing for a cabinet. We would try to orient it. Not cabinet, boxes, conduit bodies, whatever. We're orienting it in a way, basically placing it in a way, or equipping it in a way with grommets or some type of seal or something to prevent moisture from entering or prevent moisture from accumulating in it. Right? So that's just a basic rule we have to follow. So think about how you placing these things and what you're doing and making sure you're using the right boxes and right conduit bodies for the right application. And again, you're making sure that you place them or you're equipping them in a way that does prevent moisture from accumulating or entering, okay? So then the next thing it goes on to says, okay, boxes, conduit bodies, outlet box hoods, and fittings installed in wet locations shall be listed for use in wet locations. So if I'm going to use a box, if I'm going to use a fitting, and it might connect raceways, by the way, that connect two boxes, it might be the fitting on the top of a weatherhead, all of this, that if we're going to be in a wet location, then guess what? They have to be listed for use in a wet location. Okay. And again, this differs from 312.2 in a sense that 314.15 is talking about, again, boxes, conduit bodies, fittings, and handholds. You with me? So it is very specific. So if the boxes, conduit body, outlet box, hoods, fittings are installed in a wet location, guess what? They got to be listed for a wet location. Now, it goes on to say, approved drainage openings not smaller than 1/8 of an inch and not larger than 1/4 of an inch in diameter shall be permitted to be installed in the field in boxes and conduit bodies listed for use in damp or wet locations. So it allows me to put a drain hole in, whether factory is in there or I have to install one in order to maintain the ability for it to drain. Okay. And again, it can't be smaller than an eighth of an inch and not larger than a quarter of an inch. Now, it allows me to do this in the field, by the way, so I can make this adaptation to this in order to allow it. But it also reminds us that, you know what, you might have for installations of listed drain fittings, and that's what its sole function is, larger openings are permitted to be installed in the field in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. So you might have a drain fitting that needs to be installed in some piece of equipment, in this case, in any outlet box, pull box, junction box, whatever that's listed here under 314. Well, it might take a bigger hole, but that's okay as long as it's following the instructions from the listed drain fitting. And if that's the case, then it is okay. It could be larger than the quarter of an inch that is basically listed here in the general rule. You with me? All right, so it goes point blank telling you this. Now, here's some interesting observations. It tells us that these boxes, these conduit body, these outlet box hood, these fittings, when they're installed in wet locations, have to be listed for wet locations. It does not say that they have to be listed for damp location. Okay? Now, I'll remind you that a wet location is more restrictive than a damp. So in other words, if it's something is rated for a wet, then it's perfectly okay for damp. If something happens to be specifically rated for a damp, that does not equate to it being okay in a wet location. It's different. So keep those things into mind, but the code is what it is. So if it's a wet location, then the boxes, conduit bodies, the fittings that are installed in that wet location, guess what? Have to be listed for a wet location. Keeping that in mind. And then other than that, we're talking about drain holes that can be applied. Again, you have to maintain the ability for raceways to drain, and you can do that in boxes, and you can do that in the fittings as well in the field based on this allowance here. Just got to remember, not smaller than a quarter, not smaller than an eighth, not larger than a quarter. Unless you're using listed drain fittings, then the opening into the enclosure could be larger. But you have to be using a listed drain fitting. Okay, so hopefully I answered that question for you. Those are the significant differences. And you got to remember that typically in a wet location, just remember all the fittings are rated for a wet location and maintain the rating of that box. If it's a wet location box, to maintain the rating of that box usually will be taking place if you use a fitting that's rated for a wet location, then you're going to maintain that rating, that type of thing. So hopefully you got something out of that. Again, if I didn't go where you wanted me to go, I apologize. I did the best I could trying to read into your question. You know what you can do though? If any of these questions and you want more detail on it, I love it when you do follow-up questions. So anybody out there, all you got to do is make sure that you go to paulabernathy.com, put your name, put your email address, and say that I have a follow-up question to episode and give the episode, and then give your question, and I will more than happy to elaborate on it and give you an update. Again, I'm trying to cover everything in it in a reasonable amount of time. I usually try to stay less than 30 minutes for these things. But again, I'm here to serve you and appreciate all of our students that are in our Fast Tracks program and those that join me on Wednesday nights, those that listen to all of our live streams and watches our videos and joins me on Electrify with Jay. We appreciate everything you do, and we're just here to try to help you grow. There's no egos here. We just want to learn together. So if you want to join us, join the Fast Tracks program. But thank you for listening. Until next time, folks, stay safe. God bless.